Fine, we'll do this the hard way. Turn around. Place your hands behind your back.
On what grounds? You are not arresting me without cause.
I'm detaining you for impeding an investigation. Now turn around or I'll add resisting arrest to the list.
The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of Highway 87, a merciless white glare that made the air shimmer above the road. It was the kind of heat that baked into your skin, that clung to the back of your neck long after you'd stepped into the shade. For Marcus Hill, it was just another Tuesday. The dust from the construction site, a fine, reddish-brown powder, coated everything. It was in his hair, under his fingernails, and settled in a thick, gritty layer over the dark green paint of his Ford F-250. The truck wasn't just dirty, it was a rolling testament to a 10-hour day spent overseeing the foundational pour for the new city overpass. Mud, a consequence of a surprise morning thunderstorm, caked the wheel wells and splattered up the doors, drying into hard, clay-colored patterns. To Marcus, it was the look of progress, the look of a job getting done. He pulled into the Oasis Gas and Go, a small, sun-faded outpost with 4 pumps and a convenience store whose windows were plastered with faded beer advertisements. The place was an island of tired commerce in a sea of sprawling suburban developments and manicured lawns, a world away from the organized chaos of rebar and concrete he'd just left. The needle on his fuel gauge had been flirting with empty for the last 5 miles, a persistent orange glow on the dashboard. He chose the pump furthest from the store, a creature of habit who preferred a little space. As he stepped out of the cab, the heat hit him like a physical blow. He was dressed for work, not for show. Steel-toed boots scuffed with 100 scuffs, heavy-duty denim jeans faded at the knees, and a simple gray t-shirt darkened with sweat across his chest and back. At 38, Marcus had a build forged by years of physical labor mixed with the disciplined posture of a man in charge. His shoulders were broad, his hands calloused, but his movements were measured and efficient. There was no wasted energy in the way he unscrewed the gas cap or slid his credit card into the slot. He moved with a quiet competence that defined his entire life. He leaned against the side of his truck as the pump began to hum, the numbers on the digital display climbing steadily. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the familiar scent of gasoline cut through the dusty air. It was a moment of transition, the mental shift from Marcus Hill, chief project engineer, to Marcus Hill, husband and father. He was thinking about the list of groceries his wife Sarah had texted him an hour ago. Milk, bread, something for dinner. He pictured his 2 kids, their faces lighting up when he walked through the door, even covered in the day's grime. These were the thoughts that filled the quiet spaces of his day, the anchors that held him steady. A woman at the adjacent pump, driving a pristine white minivan, glanced over at him and his truck. Her eyes lingered for a second on the mud, then on his work clothes, before she quickly looked away, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. Marcus had seen that look 1,000 times. It was a look that assessed, categorized, and dismissed, all in a single fleeting moment. He had learned long ago not to let it bother him. He knew who he was. His truck was paid for. The land his house sat on was his. The project that would connect this entire side of the state was under his command. The mud and dust were just temporary layers, easily washed away. He didn't notice the patrol car at first. It was just part of the background noise of the highway, another vehicle passing by. But then the sound of the engine changed. It slowed, the low rumble of the V8 engine dropping in pitch as it turned off the main road. Marcus didn't look up. He was focused on the pump, watching the dollar amount tick past 50. It was a big tank. He was almost done. The click of the pump shutting off was a satisfying sound. He removed the nozzle, a few last drops of fuel splashing onto the concrete, and turned to screw the cap back on. That's when he saw it. The black and white cruiser wasn't just parked, it was positioned. It had pulled in at an aggressive angle, its front bumper aimed directly at his truck, effectively boxing him in. The move was deliberate, a statement of intent before a single word had been spoken. Marcus felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his gut. It was a feeling he'd hoped he had outgrown, a cold dread that had no place in the life he had built. He stood still, his hand on the gas cap, and watched as the driver's side door of the police cruiser swung open. A young officer stepped out, his movements crisp and confident. He adjusted his belt, his eyes already locked on Marcus, his expression a blank mask of authority. The quiet moment of peace was over. The heat of the afternoon suddenly felt oppressive, and the small gas station felt less like an oasis and more like a cage. Officer Dean Miller felt the boredom gnawing at him like a dull toothache. It was the third hour of his shift, and the afternoon was dragging on under the oppressive Texas sun. The world outside his air-conditioned Ford Explorer was a monotonous blur of beige strip malls and identical-looking subdivisions. He'd run a dozen plates, all clean. He'd ticketed a minivan for an expired registration, a minor victory that did little to scratch the itch. At 32, Miller had been with the Brookside County Sheriff's Department for 6 years, and the initial thrill of the badge had long since curdled into a kind of weary cynicism. He saw the world not as a community to be protected, but as a landscape of potential infractions, a place where things were constantly out of order. His job, as he saw it, was to spot the disorder, to find the piece that didn't fit. He often described his policing style as proactive, a term his sergeant praised during performance reviews. To Miller, it meant trusting his gut. It meant looking for the subtle cues that told him something was wrong. The car that was too nice for the neighborhood, the driver who avoided eye contact, the story that didn't quite add up. His gut, he believed, was a finely tuned instrument, honed by years of seeing the worst in people. But his detractors, and there were a few, had another word for it: profiling. It was a word Miller despised, a lazy accusation thrown around by people who didn't understand the realities of the street. He wasn't a racist. He was a realist. As he cruised down Highway 87, his eyes swept over the Oasis Gas and Go. It was a routine scan, a habit so ingrained he barely noticed he was doing it. His gaze slid past the minivan, the beat-up sedan, and then it stopped. It locked onto the dark green Ford F-250 at Pump 4. It wasn't the truck itself that caught his attention. F-250s were a dime a dozen in this part of the state. It was the combination of things. The truck was a late model, a King Ranch edition by the looks of it, a vehicle that, even used, cost a small fortune. And it was absolutely caked in mud. Not the kind of mud you get from a weekend of off-roading, but thick, industrial-looking clay. Then he saw the driver, a black man, dressed in what looked like dirty work clothes. The man's back was to him, but Miller's mind was already working, connecting dots, forming a narrative. A high-end truck, covered in mud, driven by a man in laborer's clothes in this part of Brookside County, a place of gated communities and high property taxes. The pieces didn't fit. His internal calculus, the one he called his gut, flagged it as an anomaly, an error in the pattern. A flicker of professional interest, the first he'd felt all day, sparked inside him. This was something. It might be nothing, but it was something. He slowed the cruiser, his knuckles whitening slightly on the steering wheel. He could just drive on. There was no violation, no probable cause. But that wasn't proactive policing. Proactive policing was about getting ahead of the crime, not just responding to it. And Miller's gut was telling him that this truck, this man, deserved a closer look. Construction sites all over the county were getting hit. Tools, copper wire, even heavy equipment going missing. It was a long shot, but long shots were what made a boring shift interesting. He made the decision in a split second. With a sharp turn of the wheel, he swung the cruiser into the gas station lot, the tires crunching on loose gravel. He didn't pull into a parking spot. He angled the vehicle directly toward the F-250, using the bulk of his Explorer to block any potential exit. It was a power move, a physical declaration of control. Let the driver know right from the start who was in charge. He put the car in park and killed the engine, but left the electronics on. He took a moment to compose himself, to slip on the mask of detached authority he wore for every stop. He looked at the man by the truck, who had just finished fueling and was now turning around. The man's posture was calm. He wasn't looking around nervously, he wasn't acting furtive. He was just standing there watching him. Miller felt a small prickle of annoyance. He preferred them nervous. Nervous was easier. Stepping out into the oppressive heat, he left the door of his cruiser open. He adjusted his duty belt, the familiar weight of his sidearm a comforting pressure on his hip. He didn't rush. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting his presence soak into the scene. He was the hunter, and he had just identified his prey. He didn't know what crime had been committed or if one had been committed at all, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He had found something out of place, and he was going to put it back in its box. Or, at the very least, he was going to shake the box and see what rattled out. The afternoon was no longer boring. Marcus Hill watched Officer Dean Miller approach, his body a study in forced stillness. He kept one hand resting on the side of his truck, the other hanging loose at his side. He didn't cross his arms, a gesture that could be misread as defiance. He didn't shove his hands in his pockets, an act that could be interpreted as concealment. He simply stood, a man at a gas pump, waiting. He had been through this routine before, in different places, at different times in his life. He knew the script. He knew the unspoken language of a stop that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with perception. Miller stopped about 10 feet away, positioning himself in the classic interview stance. Feet apart, body bladed slightly, his weapon side away from Marcus. It was textbook, but in this context it felt like theater. "Afternoon," Miller said. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth, a tool of his trade. "Officer," Marcus replied, his own voice steady. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of respect that cost him nothing. Miller's eyes weren't on Marcus's face. They were scanning the truck, moving from the muddy tires up to the roof rack and back down again. He took a slow, deliberate look at the interior through the passenger side window. "This is a nice truck you got here," he said, the words hanging in the hot, still air. It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation wrapped in a question. It was the opening line of a familiar interrogation. "How did someone like you get something like this?" "She gets the job done," Marcus answered simply, keeping his tone neutral. He wasn't going to take the bait. He wasn't going to get defensive. "Looks like you put her through the ringer today," Miller continued, gesturing vaguely at the mud-caked doors. "Been doing a little off-roading?" The question was another probe, another test. Was the story going to be plausible? Did the man fit the vehicle? "Just coming from work," Marcus said. "Construction site over by the new highway expansion." Miller's head tilted slightly, a flicker of something, disbelief maybe, in his eyes. He took a few steps closer, closing the distance between them. The air grew thicker with unspoken tension. "Construction, huh? What do you do out there?" Marcus felt the slow burn of indignation rise in his chest, but he kept his expression placid. He was a citizen refueling his vehicle. He was not a suspect. He did not owe this officer his life story. But he also knew that asserting his rights too early could be a dangerous miscalculation. The game had rules, and right now Miller was in control. "I'm an engineer," he said, the words clean and precise. The officer's lips tightened into a thin line, almost a smirk. "An engineer," he repeated, drawing the word out as if testing its weight, its truthfulness. "And they have you out playing in the mud." The condescension was palpable now, sharp and insulting. It was designed to provoke, to push him off balance. Marcus met the officer's gaze directly. "I'm the chief engineer. It's my job to be on site. I oversee the entire project." He offered the information factually, without pride or arrogance, but as a simple statement to end the line of questioning. But Miller wasn't interested in an end. He was digging. "That so? Mind if I see some identification?" The request was phrased as a question, but delivered as a command. "Am I being detained, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm, but with a new edge of formality. "Have I committed some kind of violation?" This was a critical moment. He was invoking the language of the law, reminding the officer that this encounter was governed by rules, not by his whims or suspicions. Miller's mask of detached professionalism cracked slightly. A flash of annoyance crossed his face. "I'm just having a conversation," he said, his voice hardening. "But your truck matches the description of one seen leaving the vicinity of a materials theft at a job site this morning. So yeah, you could say you're being detained. Now, I need to see your license and registration." It was a lie. Marcus knew it was a lie with absolute certainty. His truck hadn't been anywhere near the site that morning until he arrived for work at 7 a.m. It had been parked in his designated spot, in full view of the site's security cameras all day. The lie was clumsy, transparent, and utterly infuriating. It was a pretext, a tool to grant the officer the power he felt he deserved. The casual stop had now officially become an investigation. The questions were no longer about the truck, they were about him. And the question behind all the questions remained unspoken but deafeningly loud in the space between them. "What are you really doing here?" Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the anger back down. He reached carefully toward his back pocket for his wallet. The game had changed, and he knew he had to play his next move perfectly. With the lie about a stolen vehicle hanging in the air, the dynamic of the encounter shifted irrevocably. It was no longer a conversation, it was a confrontation. Marcus moved with slow, deliberate precision, telegraphing his every action. He pulled his leather wallet from his back pocket, holding it in a way that was clearly visible. He knew that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted, used against him as justification for escalation. "My license is in here," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling tension. "My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment, as required by law." Miller didn't respond. Instead of waiting for the ID, he began to circle the F-250. His movements were slow and predatory, like a wolf inspecting a potential threat. He ran a gloved hand along the side of the truck, his fingers tracing a line through the dried mud. He bent down to peer at the tires, then crouched to look underneath the chassis, as if searching for something hidden. Each action was performative, designed for an audience of one, Marcus. It was a display of dominance, a physical assertion that this vehicle, Marcus's property, was now under his scrutiny, subject to his authority. Marcus stood by the pump, wallet in hand, and watched. He felt the heat of the sun on his neck, the prickle of sweat on his brow. The officer's circling was a tactic he recognized from countless videos and news stories. It was meant to intimidate, to make the person feel trapped and powerless. With the police cruiser blocking the front and Miller now circling behind him, the feeling was suffocatingly real. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Miller said curtly, his voice coming from behind the truck. The command was absurd. Marcus was already holding his wallet out in the open. "They are, officer," Marcus replied, his patience wearing thin. Miller completed his circuit and came to a stop near the driver's side door. He cupped his hands and pressed his face against the tinted window, trying to see inside. The sight of the officer peering into his personal space, into the cab where his children's car seats were installed, sent a fresh wave of anger through Marcus. This was a violation. It felt personal. "You mentioned a theft," Marcus said, trying to steer the conversation back to the officer's supposed justification. "Can you tell me which job site? What materials were reported stolen?" He was pressing for details, knowing the officer's story would crumble under the slightest scrutiny. Miller straightened up, turning away from the window. He ignored the questions completely. "What's in the truck bed?" he asked, pointing toward the covered tonneau. "My tools, surveying equipment, blueprints," Marcus answered truthfully. "Everything I need for my job. Mind opening it up for me?" Miller's tone was casual, but the request was anything but. This was the next step in the script, a consensual search. If Marcus agreed, he would waive his Fourth Amendment rights, and anything the officer found, or claimed to find, could be used against him. "No, officer, I don't consent to any searches," Marcus stated clearly and firmly. "You said I was being detained because my truck matched a description. You have my license, you can run my plates, but you do not have my permission to search my vehicle without a warrant." He had drawn a line. It was a legal line, a constitutional line, and he had stated it without ambiguity. He saw a muscle twitch in Miller's jaw. The officer was not used to being told no, especially not by someone he had already judged and dismissed. The refusal of consent was a direct challenge to his authority, and his expression darkened. "You know," Miller said, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to a lower, more menacing register. People who have nothing to hide are usually happy to cooperate. Refusing a search just makes you look guilty. It was a classic insidious tactic, twisting the assertion of a right into an admission of guilt. "I know my rights, officer," Marcus said, his voice unwavering, "and exercising them doesn't make me guilty of anything." The two men stood in a tense standoff, the hum of the gas pumps the only sound in the charged silence. Miller's gaze was hard, his frustration palpable. He had expected compliance, perhaps some nervous stuttering. He had not expected this calm, articulate defiance. He had lost control of the narrative he was trying to build, the one where he was the sharp-eyed cop catching a thief in the act. Now he was just a man being stonewalled by someone who knew the law as well as he did, if not better. The circle of suspicion he had drawn around Marcus and his truck had failed to break him, and in Officer Miller's world, that was a problem that required a more forceful solution. The standoff at Pump 4 did not go unnoticed. What had started as a simple police interaction was now stretching into a prolonged confrontation, and the subtle theater of it was beginning to draw an audience. The woman in the white minivan, who had finished fueling several minutes ago, had not left. She sat in her driver's seat, engine idling, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold in her rearview mirror. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the steering wheel. A young man in a landscaping uniform, who had gone inside the convenience store to pay for a soda, now stood in the doorway, the cold bottle sweating in his hand. He held his phone loosely by his side, his thumb hovering over the screen, his expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The gas station attendant, a wiry older man with a weary face, peered through the glass, his brow furrowed with concern. This was no longer a private matter between two men. It had become a public spectacle, and for Marcus, this was the deepest humiliation. The silent judgment of strangers was a heavy weight. He could feel their eyes on him, could imagine the narrative spooling through their minds. They didn't see a chief engineer, a father, a respected member of his community. They saw what Officer Miller wanted them to see. A black man in dirty clothes, standing next to a nice truck, being confronted by the police. They saw a problem. Marcus was acutely aware of every detail. The way the woman in the minivan instinctively locked her doors with an audible thunk. The way the young landscaper took a half-step back, creating more distance. These were small, almost unconscious actions, but they spoke volumes. They were gestures of self-preservation, born from the assumption that where there was a cop confronting a man like him, there must be danger. His very presence had been weaponized against him, turned into a source of fear. The shame was a hot, coiling thing in his stomach. It was a shame he hadn't earned, a public stripping of his dignity. He had spent his entire adult life building a reputation based on precision, reliability, and intellect. He had navigated complex corporate structures and demanding academic environments, earning the respect of his peers through sheer competence. Yet here, in the mundane setting of a gas station, all of that was erased. He was reduced to a stereotype, a caricature drawn by a cop's prejudice and colored in by the anxieties of onlookers. Officer Miller seemed to draw energy from the audience. He was no longer just a cop doing his job, he was performing. His voice grew slightly louder, his posture more rigid. He was aware that he was being watched, and it seemed to embolden him, reinforcing his sense of righteousness. "Sir, I've asked for your license and registration," Miller said, his voice carrying across the asphalt. "You're failing to comply." "I am not failing to comply," Marcus countered, his own voice rising just enough to be clear, but not enough to sound aggressive. He held up his wallet. "I have my license right here. I am waiting for you to take it. My registration is in the vehicle, which you will have access to once this unlawful detention is clarified." He was speaking not just to Miller, but to the unseen jury of strangers. He needed them to hear his side, to understand that he was being reasonable, that he was the one following the rules. The landscaper in the doorway lifted his phone. Marcus couldn't be sure, but it looked like he had started recording. A small, desperate spark of hope ignited within him. Evidence. A third-party perspective, an objective witness that could cut through the officer's narrative. Miller noticed the phone as well. His head snapped toward the young man. "This is an official police investigation," he barked. "Put that phone away!"
The young man flinched but didn't lower the device.
"It's a public place," he mumbled, just loud enough to be heard. "I have a right to record." The small act of defiance seemed to rattle Miller more than Marcus's own pushback. The control he had so carefully cultivated was fracturing. Not only was his target refusing to break, but the audience was now documenting his every move. The weight of their stares, which had been a source of humiliation for Marcus, was now turning into a source of pressure for Miller. The officer's face flushed with anger. He turned his back on the witness, refocusing his glare on Marcus as if he were the source of this entire frustrating ordeal. The public spectacle he had created was backfiring, and the humiliation he had intended for Marcus was beginning to splash back onto him. Officer Miller was trapped. He was trapped by his own escalating rhetoric, by the calm defiance of his target, and now by the unblinking lens of a bystander's phone. He had started this stop on a flimsy pretext, a gut feeling, and had tried to build a case out of thin air. But Marcus Hill wasn't giving him anything to work with. There was no nervous sweat, no shifty eyes, no incriminating statements. Just a man who knew his rights and refused to be intimidated. Miller's frustration was curdling into a dangerous rage. He felt his authority being publicly undermined, and that was a challenge he could not let stand. He needed something more concrete than a vague, matching the description. He needed a crime, a real specific crime that would justify this entire stop and put the man in his place. His mind raced, scrambling for a plausible narrative, a hook to hang his actions on. The construction site, the mud, the tools. An idea, reckless and potent, began to form. "Let's cut the crap," Miller said, his voice low and serrated. He took another step forward, invading Marcus's personal space. The air between them was electric with hostility. About an hour ago, dispatch got a call from the foreman at the Highway 87 project site. A brand new, top-of-the-line generator and a set of laser levels walked off the site. Disappeared into thin air. He paused, letting the fabricated details sink in, watching Marcus's face for a reaction. The foreman mentioned seeing a muddy, dark green Ford F-250 leaving the area around the time the equipment went missing. Said the driver was in a hurry. It was a more elaborate lie, more detailed than the first. He was weaving a story, using the elements right in front of him, the truck, the mud, Marcus's presence, as props in his fiction. He was no longer just a cop. He was a desperate storyteller, trying to write a version of reality where he was the hero and Marcus was the villain. Marcus stared at him, a cold stillness settling over him. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was the one who would have been notified of such a theft. He knew every piece of equipment on that site, its location, its value. He knew the foreman, a man named Henderson, personally. Henderson would have called him directly, not some anonymous dispatch line. "What's the foreman's name?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the specific question. "That's confidential investigation information," he deflected, his eyes narrowing. "And what's the case number for this report?" Marcus pressed on, his legal mind, honed by years of contract negotiations and depositions, taking over. "If a report was filed, there's a number. I'd like to have it." He was calling the bluff. He was treating the officer's lie as a legitimate claim and demanding the proof that should accompany it. This was a chess move, and it put Miller in check. The officer had no foreman's name to give because there was no call. He had no case number because there was no report. Miller's face flushed a deeper shade of red. He was being outmaneuvered, exposed. The frustration he felt was now boiling over. "You're in no position to be asking me questions," he snarled. "I'm conducting an investigation, and your vehicle is smack in the middle of it. Now, for the last time, are you going to open the bed of this truck, or am I going to get a warrant and have it impounded?" The threat of impoundment was the nuclear option. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, a way to punish Marcus for his defiance even if no charges were ever filed. It would cost him time, money, and a mountain of stress to get his truck back. It was a powerful tool of coercion. But Marcus didn't flinch. The officer's desperation had made something crystal clear. This was no longer about a misunderstanding or even about profiling. This was about a personal vendetta. Officer Miller had been challenged, and now he was willing to lie, to invent a crime, to abuse his power, all to win this confrontation that he himself had started.
"You do what you feel you have to do, officer,"
Marcus said, his voice hardening into steel. "But know this, everything you are saying is being recorded. Not just by that young man over there," he gestured with his head toward the convenience store, "but likely by the gas station's own security cameras, and by your own body camera, which I trust is activated and recording this entire lawful interaction."
He had turned the tables again.
He had reminded Miller that the lies were not just being told to him, but were being etched into an official and permanent record. Every fabricated detail, every empty threat was now evidence. The lie, forged in a moment of frustration, was no longer a tool for control. It was a trap, and Officer Miller had just walked right into it. The look on the officer's face shifted from anger to something else, something colder, the dawning realization that he had made a catastrophic mistake. The mention of the body camera was a direct hit. Marcus saw Officer Miller's eyes flicker downward for a split second, a subconscious check of the small black device mounted on his chest. A tiny green light was blinking steadily. It was on. Every word, every lie was being captured. The realization seemed to momentarily stun the officer, stripping away a layer of his aggressive confidence. He had been so focused on the performance, on dominating the man in front of him, that he had momentarily forgotten the impartial witness attached to his own uniform. But the retreat was brief. Pride and the corner he had backed himself into forced him to double down. "My camera is always on," Miller snapped, trying to regain his footing. "It's going to record you obstructing my investigation." "I am not obstructing," Marcus countered, his voice a low, resonant boom that seemed to cut through the oppressive heat. "I am refusing an unlawful search. There is a difference, a significant one." He took his wallet, which he had been holding the entire time, and deliberately placed it on the roof of his truck. He then uncrossed his arms and let his hands hang open at his sides. It was a gesture of non-aggression, a clear physical statement that he was not a threat. He was drawing a line, not with words, but with his body, with his unwavering stance on the cracked concrete of the gas station lot. "You have no probable cause," Marcus continued, his tone shifting into that of an educator, a man laying out facts for a student who refused to learn. "You have a gut feeling based on the mud on my truck and the clothes I'm wearing. You fabricated a story about a theft that you cannot substantiate with a name or a case number. You are now threatening to impound my vehicle to coerce me into waiving my Fourth Amendment rights. Any judge in this country would see this for exactly what it is, officer, harassment under the color of law." He used the phrase, color of law, deliberately. It was a specific legal term, one that carried immense weight. It implied an abuse of power, a violation of civil rights. It was the language of lawsuits. Miller's face was a thunderous mask of fury. He was being lectured on the law by the very man he had profiled as a common criminal. The humiliation was total. The audience of strangers, the recording cell phone, and now this calm, articulate takedown of his entire procedure. It was all too much. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Miller spat, the words laced with venom. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" "There is nothing to talk my way out of," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm a citizen, on my way home from work getting gas. You created this situation, officer. You are the only one who can de-escalate it." He had offered him an out, a chance to back down, to recognize his mistake and walk away. He could run the plates, see they came back clean, and end the encounter. It was a lifeline, a chance to cut his losses before the hole he was digging reached his neck. For a long moment, Miller just stood there, breathing heavily. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting impulses. Part of him, the small, rational part, knew the man was right. The stop was bad. The lie was worse. The recording was a disaster. But the larger part of him, the part fueled by ego and a deep-seated need to be in control, could not accept defeat. Backing down now in front of the minivan mom and the kid with the phone felt like a public castration. It was a surrender he was unwilling to make.
He made his choice.
"Fine," Miller said, his voice dangerously soft. "We'll do this the hard way. Turn around. Place your hands behind your back."
Marcus's blood ran cold.
The request was preposterous, an insane leap of logic. He had done nothing to warrant an arrest. He had not been threatening. He had not resisted. He had simply stood his ground and stated his rights.
On what grounds?
Marcus demanded, his voice rising for the first time, disbelief warring with anger. "You are not arresting me without cause."
I'm detaining you for impeding an investigation,
Miller declared, his hand moving purposefully toward the handcuffs clipped to his belt. "Now turn around or I'll add resisting arrest to the list."
The line drawn in the concrete had been crossed.
The officer was no longer even pretending to operate within the bounds of the law. This was raw power, a desperate and illegal assertion of dominance. The situation had spiraled from a baseless stop into a full-blown constitutional crisis, right there between pumps 3 and 4, under the indifferent gaze of the afternoon sun. And Marcus knew, with a terrifying certainty, that his life was now in imminent danger. The moment Officer Miller reached for his handcuffs was the moment the air changed. The oppressive heat of the afternoon suddenly felt chilling. The distant drone of highway traffic seemed to fade into a dull roar, and the world narrowed to the 10 feet of cracked asphalt separating the two men. This was the point of no return. Marcus's mind, usually a place of calm logic and ordered plans, became a frantic storm of calculations. Do I comply? Do I resist? Complying with an unlawful arrest felt like a surrender of his very soul, an admission of guilt he did not possess. But resisting, even passively, could be a death sentence. He had seen the videos. He knew how quickly a situation like this could turn tragic. A taser, a baton, a knee on the neck. The possibilities were sickeningly vivid. He didn't move. He stood his ground, his feet planted firmly, his hands still open at his sides. "Officer, you are making a grave mistake," he said, his voice low and taut with a mixture of warning and pleading. "Think very carefully about what you are doing." Miller, however, was past the point of careful thought. He was operating on pure, visceral emotion. Anger, humiliation, and a desperate need to reassert his dominance. He unsnapped the handcuffs from his belt, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence. It was a sound of finality. As he took a step forward, his right hand, the one not holding the cuffs, drifted down. It didn't go for his taser. It drifted lower, his fingers brushing against the hard polymer grip of his Glock 19. He didn't unholster it. He didn't even grip it fully. He just let his hand rest there, a casual, almost unconscious gesture that was anything but. It was a message. The implied threat was more powerful than a spoken one. The cold, black steel of the firearm was a silent third party in the conversation, a final arbiter in any disagreement. It said, "Your rights, your logic, your words, they all end where this begins." It was the ultimate expression of power, a reminder of the monopoly on violence that his uniform granted him. Marcus saw the gesture and his breath caught in his throat. The theoretical danger had just become terrifyingly real. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to raise his hands, to do whatever it took to de-escalate. But another deeper instinct, the part of him that was a father, a leader, a man who refused to be broken, held him fast. To surrender now would be to validate every false assumption, every bigoted judgment the officer had made. "Don't do this, Miller," Marcus said, his voice dropping the formal "officer." He was speaking to the man now, not the uniform. "There is no winning this for you, not anymore." The use of his name seemed to jolt Miller. It was too familiar, too equal. "You don't get to use my name," he snarled, taking another aggressive step forward. "You are a suspect, now turn around." The woman in the minivan let out a small, audible gasp. The young man with the phone took a nervous step back, but his camera remained steady, a silent, unwavering eye. He was capturing it all, the handcuffs, the hand hovering over the gun, the raw, undisguised aggression on the officer's face. Time seemed to slow down. Marcus could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs. He could see the individual beads of sweat on Miller's forehead, the frantic pulse beating in the officer's thick neck. He saw a man who had lost control of himself, a man so consumed by the need to win that he was willing to burn down his own career and potentially end a life to do it. The space between them had shrunk to less than an arm's length. The smell of the officer's sweat and cheap deodorant was sharp in the air. Miller raised the handcuffs, his knuckles white. Marcus braced himself, his muscles tensing for an impact he knew was coming. The steel was cold. The threat was no longer implied. It was inches away, ready to close around his wrists and steal his freedom. The world had become a tiny, volatile stage, and the final act was about to begin. From his vantage point in the doorway of the Oasis Gas and Go, Leo Ramirez felt his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. At 21, Leo had seen his fair share of tense situations growing up, but nothing like this. Not this up close. Not this raw. He was just a landscaper, trying to get through another brutally hot day. He'd stopped for a Gatorade, and now he was a witness to a slow-motion car crash of civil rights. His first instinct when Officer Miller had yelled at him was to put the phone away. He wasn't a troublemaker. The last thing he needed was a cop's attention. But then he looked at the black man by the truck. He saw the man's composure, the way he stood tall and spoke clearly, never raising his voice, never making a threatening move. And he saw the officer, his face contorted with a rage that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ugly. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a sour taste in his mouth. He thought of his own father, who had been pulled over more times than he could count for driving while brown in his work truck. So he kept recording. His hands were slick with sweat, and he had to grip the phone tightly to keep it steady. He wasn't some activist or journalist. He just knew on a gut level that what he was seeing was wrong, and that the phone in his hand was the only thing that might make a difference. It was a shield. It was a weapon. It was a memory that couldn't be denied or distorted. He framed the shot carefully, making sure to get both men in the frame. He zoomed in just enough to capture the officer's hand drifting down to his firearm, the glint of the sun on the handcuffs. He could hear their voices clearly, the audio on his phone surprisingly sharp in the quiet tension of the lot. He recorded Marcus's calm recitation of his rights and Miller's escalating, baseless accusations. He was capturing the truth, unedited and undeniable. When Miller took that final step, handcuffs raised, Leo felt a jolt of fear so intense it almost made him drop the phone. This was it. This was the moment it turned violent. He held his breath, his finger locked on the screen, his mind screaming, "Don't stop recording! Whatever happens, don't stop!" The unblinking eye of his cell phone camera became the most powerful force in the parking lot. It was more powerful than Miller's badge, more powerful than the implied threat of his gun. It was a silent testament, a digital witness that saw everything without bias or prejudice. It saw the color of Marcus's skin and the mud on his truck. It saw the rage in Miller's eyes and the lie on his lips. It recorded the precise moment a lawful refusal was twisted into a pretext for arrest. Miller, in his rage, seemed to have forgotten about the phone. His entire focus was narrowed down to the man in front of him, the man who had dared to defy him. But the camera saw him. It saw everything. As Miller lunged forward to grab Marcus's arm, another sound cut through the air. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and authoritative. "Dean, what the hell are you doing?" The voice came from the edge of the lot. Another cruiser had pulled in, silently, its arrival unnoticed in the heat of the confrontation. A second officer, older and heavier, with sergeant's stripes on his sleeves, was striding towards them. His face was a grim mask of disbelief. The sound of his name, shouted with such authority by a superior, was like a bucket of ice water on Miller. He froze mid-lunge, his hand hovering inches from Marcus's arm. He turned, his expression a mixture of shock and guilt, like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. The sergeant's eyes took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Miller poised to make an arrest, the open handcuffs glinting in the sun. Marcus standing his ground, and Leo standing in the doorway, his phone held up like a torch in the darkness. The sergeant understood immediately. He knew this wasn't a good stop. He knew, without hearing a single word of explanation, that he had just walked into a disaster.
And Leo kept recording.
He panned the camera from the frozen tableau of Miller and Marcus to the approaching sergeant. He was no longer just a bystander. He was a documentarian. The unblinking eye of his phone had not only captured the crime, it was now capturing the beginning of the consequences. The story was not over, and he was going to make sure the world saw how it ended. Sergeant Frank Russo felt the familiar throb of a migraine begin behind his right eye. He'd been a cop for 20 years, and he could smell a bad stop from 100 yards away. This one reeked. He'd been rolling past on his way back to the station when he recognized Miller's cruiser parked at that aggressive, theatrical angle. Miller had a reputation. He was a go-getter in the department's sanitized jargon. Russo had a different term for it, a lawsuit waiting to happen.
"I asked you a question, Miller,"
Russo said, his voice a low growl. He came to a stop a few feet away, deliberately placing himself between his officer and the civilian. "What is going on here?" Miller, momentarily broken from his rage-fueled trance, scrambled to regain control. His training kicked in, and he immediately began to construct a narrative that would justify his actions. He was trying to poison the well before Marcus could even speak.
"Sarge, I've got a situation here,"
Miller said, his voice still tight but attempting a tone of professional control. "This individual is being uncooperative. His vehicle matches the description of one involved in a felony theft from the 87 expansion site this morning. High-value equipment. He's refusing a search and refusing to identify himself." Every word was a distortion, a carefully crafted piece of a larger lie. He didn't say he'd already seen the man's wallet. He didn't say the man had offered his registration. He painted Marcus as obstructive and suspicious, casting himself as the diligent officer thwarted by a potential felon. It was Miller's word against Marcus's, and in the world of law enforcement, that was usually an easy win. Russo's gaze shifted from Miller to Marcus. He saw a man who did not look like a belligerent suspect. He saw a man standing calmly, his hands open, his expression one of weary resolve, not guilt. Then Russo's eyes flicked over to the convenience store, where the young man was still openly recording. Marcus didn't wait for Russo to ask. He spoke, his voice clear and even, a stark contrast to Miller's frantic justification. "Sergeant," Marcus began, addressing Russo with respect, "that is not what happened. Your officer has been harassing me since he arrived. He blocked my vehicle without cause. He accused me of theft based on a report that he cannot produce a case number for. I offered him my identification, which he refused to take. I asserted my constitutional right to refuse an unlawful search of my property. For that, he was about to arrest me." Russo listened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. He was weighing the two stories, the two men. One was his own officer, part of the Brotherhood. The other was a civilian. But one story was fraying at the edges, while the other was a solid, consistent line. "Miller," Russo said, turning back to his subordinate, "did you run the plates on the vehicle?" A flicker of panic in Miller's eyes. It was such a basic first step, a foundational piece of any legitimate vehicle stop. In his haste to confront and dominate, he hadn't even bothered. "I was getting to it, Sarge. The situation escalated."
"Did you—"
"No, Sarge," Miller admitted, his gaze dropping to the asphalt. The admission hung in the air, a confession of procedural failure. It was the first solid crack in Miller's story. A cop investigating a supposed felony theft who doesn't run the license plate? It made no sense.
Russo looked back at Marcus.
"Sir, may I see your driver's license?" he asked. His tone was professional, a world away from Miller's accusatory demands.
Marcus nodded.
He walked to his truck, picked up his wallet from the roof, and handed it to the sergeant. Russo took it, opened it, and read the name. His eyes then went to the vehicle's registration sticker on the windshield, then back to the license. While Russo examined the ID, Miller, sensing the ground collapsing beneath him, tried one last desperate gambit. "Sarge, the guy was acting suspicious. He's got something to hide, I know it." The echo of his false narrative was a pathetic, fading cry. He was pleading now, trying to salvage some shred of justification for his actions. But Russo wasn't listening to him anymore. He was looking at the small, blinking green light on Miller's chest. He knew the body cam footage would tell the true story, and he had a sinking feeling that the story it told would be the one described by the calm, dignified man in the work clothes, not the one being spun by his own hot-headed deputy. The well had been poisoned, but Sergeant Russo was experienced enough to know that sometimes the poisoner is the first one to drink. Sergeant Russo handed the wallet back to Marcus. "Mr. Hill," he said, his voice formal but no longer accusatory. "Thank you." He turned to Miller, his face a granite mask of controlled fury. The professional courtesy was gone.
Miller, in my car, now. It wasn't a request.
It was an order that carried the full weight of his rank and his 20 years on the force. It was a command that signaled the complete and utter demolition of Miller's authority. For a moment, Officer Dean Miller simply stood there, handcuffs still dangling from his left hand. His face was a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. He had lost. In front of the minivan mom, in front of the kid with the camera, in front of the suspect who had turned out to be unshakable, he had been publicly and professionally castrated by his own supervisor. The narrative he had so desperately tried to control had been ripped from his hands.
Sarge, listen,
he started, a desperate last-ditch attempt to explain, to salvage, to rewind the last 15 minutes.
Did you hear what I said?
Russo's voice was ice. "My car, now, and give me those." He gestured towards the handcuffs. Numbly, Miller handed the cuffs to his sergeant. The transfer was symbolic. He was relinquishing not just the cuffs, but his power, his judgment, his control over the scene. Russo clipped them back onto his own belt without a word. The cold click of the metal snapping into place was the final sound in the drama that had played out at Pump 4. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on Miller's career. Without another word, Miller turned and walked toward Russo's cruiser. His confident swagger was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders and shuffling gait of a defeated man. He got into the passenger seat and pulled the door shut, enclosing himself in a bubble of shame and silence. He stared forward through the windshield, seeing nothing. Russo watched him go before turning back to Marcus. The sergeant's face was etched with a deep, professional weariness. This was the part of the job he hated most, cleaning up the messes made by bad cops, trying to rebuild the fragile bridge of public trust that men like Miller burned down with their arrogance. "Mr. Hill," Russo began, his voice heavy with sincerity, "on behalf of the Brookside County Sheriff's Department, I want to apologize. What happened here was unacceptable. It was not by the book, and it was not right." Marcus simply nodded, his body still thrumming with adrenaline. The apology was necessary, but it felt hollow, insufficient to patch the hole that had been torn in his sense of safety and dignity. "I need to get your information, if you don't mind," Russo continued, pulling out a small notepad. "And the information of anyone else who witnessed this." His eyes flicked pointedly toward Leo, who was now slowly lowering his phone, realizing the immediate danger had passed. Leo walked forward tentatively. I got the whole thing on video, sir," he said, his voice a little shaky. Russo looked at him, and for the first time a faint, grim smile touched his lips. "I have a feeling you did, son. Don't delete it. An internal affairs investigator will be in contact with you." The sergeant took down Marcus's and Leo's contact information. The entire process was quiet, methodical, the somber administrative task of documenting a disaster. The tension had broken, but the air was thick with the fallout. The minivan had finally driven away, the driver likely rushing home to recount the story. The gas station attendant had retreated back behind his counter. When Russo was finished, he handed Marcus a business card with his name and a complaint number already written on the back. "This is the official start of an internal investigation against Officer Miller," he said. "You will be contacted. I give you my word that this will be taken very seriously." Marcus took the card. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said. It was all he could manage. He was exhausted, the emotional toll of the encounter crashing down on him. Russo gave him a final nod, a look of profound regret in his eyes, before walking back to his cruiser. He got in, spoke briefly into his radio, and then pulled away, leaving Marcus alone at the pump. Marcus stood there for a long moment, the business card feeling heavy in his hand. The scene was quiet now. The only evidence of the confrontation was the lingering scent of Miller's rage and the invisible scars it had left on his own psyche. He looked at his truck, his tools, his muddy boots, the very things that had been used to condemn him. He got into the driver's seat and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The click of the cuffs had been the end of the confrontation, but it was the beginning of something else entirely. The fight was far from over. The silence that descended on the Oasis Gas and Go after Sergeant Russo's cruiser disappeared down the highway was profound. It was a heavy, ringing silence, the kind that follows a loud explosion. Marcus Hill sat in the cab of his F-250, the engine off, his hands still clenched around the steering wheel. His knuckles were white. He was consciously forcing his body to relax, telling his muscles to unclench, his heart to slow its frantic pace. The adrenaline that had flooded his system was beginning to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a tremor in his hands he couldn't quite control. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes told a different story. They were wide, haunted by the what-ifs. What if Sergeant Russo hadn't shown up? What if Miller had successfully cuffed him, thrown him in the back of a car? What if that hand resting on the gun had twitched? The scenarios played out in his mind, each one more terrifying than the last. He had done everything right, stayed calm, asserted his rights, refused to be provoked, and yet he had come terrifyingly close to becoming another statistic, another name in a headline. Leo Ramirez approached the driver's side window, his face a mixture of awe and concern. "Hey, man, you okay?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Marcus rolled down the window, the electronic hum sounding unnaturally loud. He managed a small, tired smile. "I will be. Thank you." He looked at Leo, truly seeing him for the first time not as just a witness, but as an ally. "What you did, keeping that camera on him, you have no idea how important that was." "No problem, man," Leo said, shuffling his feet. "That was messed up. What he did was messed up." He held up his phone. "I've got it all right here, clear as day. What do you want me to do with it?" It was a critical question. The video was a piece of evidence, a digital bombshell. The official process would be to hand it over to Internal Affairs, to let the slow, grinding wheels of institutional justice turn. But Marcus knew how those wheels could get bogged down, how stories could be contained, how reports could be buried. "Hold on to it," Marcus said after a moment's thought. "The sergeant said IA will contact you. Cooperate with them, give them a copy, but don't delete your original. And," he paused, a new resolve hardening in his eyes, "send a copy to me. And then, if you're comfortable with it, I think the public deserves to see what happened here today." Leo's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want me to post it?" "I want the truth to be seen," Marcus clarified. "No edits, no commentary, just what happened. People need to see how quickly things can go wrong. They need to see what men like Officer Miller are capable of." "You got it," Leo said, nodding enthusiastically. He took Marcus's number, promising to send the file immediately and then upload it to his social media accounts. They exchanged a look of mutual respect, two strangers bound by a moment of shared injustice. As Leo walked away, Marcus finally started his truck. The powerful engine rumbled to life, a familiar, comforting sound. He needed to leave this place. He pulled out of the gas station, his tires crunching over the same gravel where the confrontation began. He drove mechanically, his mind a million miles away. He had forgotten all about the groceries his wife had asked for. The simple domestic errand now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. His phone buzzed. It was a notification that a large video file had been received. Leo had kept his word. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. A text from Leo. "It's up. Tagged all the local news stations. Good luck, man." The fuse had been lit. The digital evidence, the objective truth of the last 20 minutes, was no longer confined to the memory of a few people at a gas station. It was loose, It was propagating through the invisible networks that connect the modern world, traveling at the speed of light. The aftermath at the pump was over, but the digital shockwave was just beginning to spread. And Marcus knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and empowering, that his life and the life of Officer Dean Miller would never be the same again. The internet moves at the speed of outrage. Leo Ramirez's video, uploaded with a simple factual title, "Cop Harasses Man at Brookside Gas Station," was a digital spark dropped into a vast, dry forest of public discontent. At first, the views trickled in. Friends of Leo saw it, then friends of friends. A local community watch group shared it on their Facebook page. A student from the local high school posted it on TikTok. And then, someone with a massive following on X, a well-known civil rights activist, retweeted it. That's when the trickle became a flood. By the time Marcus got home, the video had 10,000 views. He walked through the door, the day's grime still on him, and was met by his wife, Sarah. She took one look at his face and knew something was terribly wrong. He didn't have to say a word. She wrapped her arms around him and he leaned into her embrace, the full weight of the day finally crashing down on him. He was safe, but he was not okay. While he stood in the shower, letting the hot water wash away the mud and the lingering feeling of violation, the video passed 100,000 views. The comments section was a torrent of fury, a digital roar of disbelief and anger. This is what they do, and they wonder why we don't trust them. Look at the calm on that man's face, the dignity. He's a better man than I am. Fire Officer Miller, now! Number Brookside corruption, asterisk, asterisk. That kid with the camera is a hero, asterisk, asterisk. The hashtag Justice for Marcus Hill began to trend locally. News vans, alerted by the social media storm and the tags from Leo's original post, were already setting up outside the Brookside County Sheriff's Department. The department's public information officer, a man accustomed to dealing with minor fender benders and community bake sales, was suddenly fielding calls from national news outlets. His phone was ringing off the hook. By dinner time, a meal Marcus barely touched, the video had surpassed 1 million views. It was no longer a local story. It was national news. Cable news channels were breaking into their regular programming to show clips of it. Legal analysts were dissecting every second of the footage, praising Marcus's composure and condemning Miller's catastrophic failure of training and temperament. The verdict of the crowd was swift, unanimous, and brutal. Officer Dean Miller was not just a bad cop, he was the embodiment of a corrupt system. Marcus Hill was not a suspect. He was a symbol of quiet, dignified resistance against tyranny. The pressure on the sheriff's department was immense. Their official Facebook page was inundated with thousands of angry comments and one-star reviews. Their phone lines were jammed. Sheriff Henderson, a politician at heart, saw his career flashing before his eyes. He quickly issued a press release. The Brookside County Sheriff's Department is aware of a disturbing video circulating on social media involving one of our deputies. We want to assure the public that we take these matters with the utmost seriousness. The deputy involved has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full and thorough internal investigation. Administrative leave. The phrase was meant to sound decisive, but the public read it for what it was: a paid vacation. The outrage only intensified. Protesters, organized spontaneously through social media, began to gather outside the sheriff's department, holding signs with Miller's face on them and chanting Marcus's name. Marcus and Sarah watched the news, stunned into silence. Their quiet suburban life had been invaded. Their front yard was now illuminated by the harsh glare of news cameras. Reporters were camped out on their street. Marcus felt like a man swept up in a hurricane. He had wanted the truth to be seen, but he had never anticipated this. This tidal wave of attention was overwhelming, a raw, powerful force that he had unleashed but could no longer control. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict. They had judged Miller guilty on all counts. But Marcus knew that this verdict, as satisfying as it was, carried no legal weight. The real battle The one that would be fought not with hashtags and angry comments, but with motions and depositions, was yet to come. The crowd had given him a voice, but now he had to use it in the one place where it truly mattered: a court of law. In the 2 weeks that followed the incident at the Oasis Gas and Go, Marcus Hill's life was turned upside down. He was a reluctant celebrity, his face a fixture on the evening news. He was inundated with interview requests, invitations to speak at rallies, and messages of support from strangers across the globe. But through it all, he remained quiet. He issued one brief, dignified statement through a newly hired attorney, thanking the public for their support and asking for privacy for his family. He did not go on television. He did not give fiery speeches. He understood that the ephemeral outrage of the masses was not justice. Justice was a different beast entirely, slower, colder, and far more methodical. His attorney was Benjamin Carter, a renowned civil rights lawyer from the city, a man whose calm demeanor belied a reputation as a legal shark. They met not in a sterile office, but in Marcus's own living room. Carter didn't come with a flashy presentation, he came to listen. For hours, he let Marcus recount the story, every detail, every feeling. He watched the video from Leo's phone, then the gas station security footage, and finally the body cam footage, which they had obtained through a formal request. The body cam footage was the most damning of all. The audio was crystal clear. It captured Miller's initial baseless questioning. It captured his condescending tone when Marcus identified himself as an engineer. Most importantly, it captured the moment Marcus calmly asked for the foreman's name and the case number, and Miller's flustered, angry deflection. The lie was not just documented, it was captured in high definition from the liar's own perspective. He never had any intention of investigating a crime, Carter said, his voice quiet but firm as he watched the playback. He was investigating your audacity to exist in his presence in a way that didn't fit his worldview. This wasn't a mistake, Marcus. This was an act of malice. That was the moment the path forward became clear. This wasn't just about getting an officer fired. Firing Miller would be like cutting a single weed and leaving the roots intact. This had to be about changing the system that produced and protected officers like him. To do that, they needed to hit the county where it hurt most: its budget. The lawsuit they filed was not a loud press conference affair. It was filed quietly on a Wednesday morning. The paperwork was precise, clinical, and devastatingly thorough. It listed the defendants, Officer Dean Miller and Brookside County. It laid out the causes of action: unlawful detention, malicious prosecution, violation of 4th and 14th Amendment rights, racial profiling, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Each claim was supported by meticulously time-stamped evidence from the 3 different video sources. The complaint read less like a plea for justice and more like an airtight indictment. It detailed Miller's aggressive positioning of his vehicle, his fabricated claims of a theft, his refusal to accept identification, his attempt to coerce a search, and the ultimate, terrifying moment when he reached for his weapon. And then there was the final page, the one that detailed the damages sought. It wasn't a random number plucked from the air. It was a calculated figure, designed to send a shockwave through the county government and the nation's law enforcement community. They weren't asking for an apology, they were demanding accountability. The number was thunderous: $15 million. The news of the lawsuit broke that afternoon. It was the lead story everywhere. $15 million. The figure was staggering, designed to make people gasp. County commissioners who had been hoping the story would fade away were suddenly faced with a fiscal nightmare. Their insurance premiums would skyrocket. Their bond rating could be affected. This lawsuit wasn't just about one man's dignity. It was about the financial solvency of Brookside County. While the media and the public debated the astronomical sum, Marcus went back to work. He put on his hard hat and his steel-toed boots and drove to the construction site in his now famous green F-250. He needed the normalcy, the reassuring logic of stress load calculations and concrete curing times. The lawsuit had been filed. The first move in the long, arduous chess match had been made. He had laid down the gauntlet, not with a shout, but with the quiet, powerful rustle of legal papers. The real fight was just beginning. The legal process moved with the glacial pace of justice. Months crawled by, filled with motions, counter-motions, and legal maneuvering by the county's high-priced lawyers. Their strategy was clear: to delay, to frustrate, and to wear Marcus down, hoping he would accept a lowball settlement and disappear quietly. They painted Officer Miller as a young, proactive cop who made an unfortunate but understandable mistake in a high-pressure situation. They painted Marcus as an opportunist, looking for a payday. The turning point came during the deposition phase. A deposition is not held in a grand courtroom, but in a sterile, soulless conference room. There is no judge, no jury, just lawyers, a court reporter, and the person being questioned under oath. It is where cases are often won or lost, where truth is meticulously extracted, one painful question at a time. Officer Dean Miller was the first to be deposed. Stripped of his uniform, his badge, and his weapon, he looked smaller, younger, and deeply uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit. Under the precise, relentless questioning of Ben Carter, Miller's story began to unravel. He couldn't remember the details of the fictitious theft report. He stumbled when asked why he didn't run the truck's license plates. His body cam footage was played back for him, and he was forced to explain, frame by frame, his own aggressive actions and transparent lies. By the end of the day, he was a sweating, stammering mess. Then came the first bombshell. Carter's team had done their homework. Through discovery, they had obtained Miller's complete personnel file. "Officer Miller," Carter said, his voice deceptively calm, "is it true that in your 6 years with the department, you have been the subject of 12 separate civilian complaints for aggressive conduct and profiling?" The county's lawyer shouted, "Objection!" But it was too late. The question was on the record. Miller paled, looking to his lawyer for help, but there was none to be had. He was under oath. I don't recall the exact number," he mumbled. "Would it refresh your memory to see the files?" Carter asked, gesturing to a thick binder on the table. Complaints from a 65-year-old retired school teacher, a 45-year-old doctor, a 28-year-old accountant, all of whom, coincidentally, happened to be black. None of these complaints resulted in disciplinary action, did they, officer? They were all deemed unsubstantiated, buried. The county's legal team knew they were in trouble. This wasn't just one bad stop. Carter was establishing a clear, undeniable pattern of behavior, and a pattern of the department's failure to address it. The following week, it was Marcus's turn to be deposed. The county's lawyers hoped to paint him as uncooperative and hostile, to find some crack in his story. But he remained as he was in the video, calm, factual, and unshakable. Then, Ben Carter began his own questioning of his client, designed for the record. "Mr. Hill," Carter began, "please state your full name and occupation for the record." "Marcus Hill. I am a civil engineer." "And what is your current professional title?" "I am the Chief Project Engineer for the Tri-State Area for Infrastructure Solutions International." The county's lead lawyer, a man named Henderson, looked up from his notes, a flicker of confusion on his face. Carter continued, "And what is the largest and most significant project you are currently managing?" Marcus looked directly at Henderson, his gaze steady. "I am the lead engineer and final authority on the Highway 87 expansion project, including the new city overpass." Silence. A thick, stunned silence filled the conference room. Henderson's jaw went slack. The Highway 87 project was the largest public works initiative in the county's history. It was a multi-hundred-million-dollar contract that the entire region's economic future depended on. And the man his client, Officer Miller, had accused of stealing a generator from that very site was, in fact, the man in charge of the entire project. The bombshell had landed. It wasn't just that Miller had profiled an innocent man. It was that in his blind arrogance, he had harassed and attempted to arrest the single most important figure connected to the county's flagship infrastructure project. The lie about the theft wasn't just a lie, It was a preposterous, career-ending blunder of epic proportions. The county's lawyer slowly closed his legal pad. He looked at Marcus, then at Ben Carter, and then at the ceiling as if praying for deliverance. He knew in that moment that the case was over. They had lost. The only question left was how much it was going to cost them. The revelation in the deposition room was the kill shot. The county's case, already wounded by the video evidence and Miller's history of complaints, was now definitively dead. The image of a county deputy attempting to arrest the chief engineer of their own vital highway project on fabricated charges was a public relations and legal nightmare from which there was no escape. The county's lawyers, recognizing the futility of a trial, immediately moved for a settlement conference. The negotiations were swift. The county had no leverage. Ben Carter and his team held all the cards. The final settlement was not the full $15 million, but it was a staggering figure nonetheless, $8.5 million. It was one of the largest civil rights settlements in the state's history. But the victory wasn't just financial. Carter, at Marcus's insistence, had negotiated for more than just money. The terms of the settlement were transformative. Dean Miller was to be fired immediately, with his record flagged in a way that would prevent him from being easily hired by another police department in the state, a crucial measure to stop the gypsy cop phenomenon. But the changes went deeper. The Brookside County Sheriff's Department was forced to agree to a comprehensive reform package, overseen by an independent federal monitor. This package included a complete overhaul of their use of force policies. It mandated department-wide implicit bias and de-escalation training, taught not by fellow officers, but by outside civilian experts. A new, more robust early warning system was to be implemented to flag officers like Miller who accumulated multiple citizen complaints. Perhaps most significantly, the department had to disband its so-called proactive street crimes unit, which had been responsible for a disproportionate number of baseless stops and searches in minority communities. They were building a new foundation, not of concrete and steel, but of accountability and trust. The news of the settlement and the reforms was met with celebration by the community activists who had rallied to Marcus's cause. It was a victory, a tangible, systemic change born from one man's refusal to be broken. Marcus never saw a dime of the settlement money himself. He and Sarah had decided early on what they would do. They used the entirety of the funds to establish the Hill Foundation for Justice and Accountability, a non-profit dedicated to providing legal resources for victims of police misconduct and funding scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in engineering, law, and public policy. He wasn't just compensated, he was reinvesting his pain back into the community, hoping to build something better for the next generation. His life slowly returned to a semblance of normal. The news vans eventually left his street. He went back to overseeing the highway project, walking the job site with the same quiet authority as before. But something had changed within him. He was more watchful, more aware of the fragility of the peace he had built. He carried the memory of that afternoon at the gas station not as a burden, but as a reminder of his own strength and of the constant, necessary vigilance required to protect one's rights and dignity. Looking back, it's easy to see the encounter at the Oasis Gas and Go as a simple clash between a good man and a bad cop. But the truth, as always, is more complex. The actions of Officer Dean Miller didn't spring from a vacuum. They were the product of a mindset, a culture that rewards aggression and suspicion over curiosity and respect. What drove him wasn't just personal prejudice, but a deep-seated professional insecurity. In his world, control was paramount. When Marcus Hill, a man he had already categorized and dismissed, refused to cede that control, Miller didn't see a citizen exercising his rights. He saw a threat to his entire identity as an authority figure. His lies weren't just a tactic. They were a desperate attempt to reshape reality into a form where he was right and in charge. One can't help but wonder what might have been. What if Marcus had lost his temper, had shouted back, had met aggression with aggression. The video would have told a different story. The narrative would have been muddied, and the public's verdict might not have been so clear. His incredible restraint, his almost superhuman calm, was his most powerful weapon. It allowed Miller's bigotry to stand alone, exposed in the harsh light of day without any distraction. And what if there had been no camera? What if Leo Ramirez had decided it wasn't his business and walked away? The answer is chillingly simple. Miller's false report would have become the official record. Marcus would have been just another black man arrested, another life derailed by a system that too often believes the badge over the citizen. The incident would have been a quiet tragedy, buried in a file, another complaint marked unsubstantiated. The story of Marcus Hill is a testament to the power of composure and the absolute necessity of documentation. It teaches us that standing firm on one's rights is not an act of defiance, but an act of self-preservation. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful force for change isn't a protest placard or a shouted slogan, but the unblinking eye of a camera and the quiet, unwavering voice of a person speaking their truth to power. Justice wasn't just found in the multi-million-dollar settlement. It was forged in that moment of quiet dignity at a gas station pump. We share these stories not just to highlight injustice, but to empower. It leaves us with questions we must all consider. Have you ever witnessed a situation where you felt someone was being treated unfairly and wished you had done something? What do you believe is the most effective way for an ordinary person to create positive change in their community? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please, subscribe for more stories that need to be heard.